For those of you who are on the webinar, if you have colleagues who were also hoping to participate, Brendan is recording this webinar, and it'll be posted shortly after we are finished. Okay, so this is exciting because this is the first year that we've presented a new project RFP webinar. And really one of the main reasons to do this year is to ensure that folks who have not applied for funding in previous years really understand what the process looks like, and also in order to present data from a gaps analysis that was completed based on PIT data and coordinated entry data, which Jessica is going to walk you through later this morning during the webinar. I'll just point out that if you have questions throughout, I know that everyone on the line is muted, but there is a chat function, and I believe that we can see your questions as they come in. If we can't answer your question, we will certainly make a note of it and follow up, but feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar. You don't have to wait till the end or anything like that. So during today's webinar, this current slide is the agenda. We're going to walk through the new project RFP. There were two released. One is for the COC bonus, which will be a new a new permanent housing project. And secondly, the DV bonus, the $50 million that was set aside by Congress to expand housing for survivors of domestic violence. Thirdly, we are going to talk about the concept of expansion and transition. We're also going to just talk a little bit about the new project application process and timeline. As I already mentioned, we're going to walk through the gaps analysis to sort of provide you some data to support your application. And then we're going to just really quickly show you that this slide deck includes some information or tips for eSNAPs. We're not going to go through that information this morning for a couple of reasons. The primary reason is that in order to complete the preliminary application, which is the step that we are on right now, you don't need to log into eSNAPs. The only folks who will be logging into eSNAPs are those folks who are selected by the funding committee to apply formally through the COC and have their application submitted to HUD. This first step is a submission to the COC. And so if you are selected, you'll need to know these eSNAP tips at that time. And if you're not selected, you won't need to know them at all right now. So in order to be more timely, we're just going to provide this to you for reference versus reviewing it in significant detail, as well as give you some resources that you can rely on, which will be helpful during both the preliminary application process and the eSNAPs process. And then finally, if you haven't already submitted a question and you have one, you'll be able to submit a question at the end. So we're going to get started with the first of two RFPs, the COC bonus dollars and the new project housing, new permanent housing projects that are being solicited through that RFP. So eligible project types include permanent supportive housing projects specifically dedicated to serving individuals and families who are chronically homeless, rapid rehousing, and then the THRH joint component. You're going to hear me call this probably 3 or 4 different things throughout the course of today's webinar. It's transitional housing, rapid rehousing, joint component. You may hear me refer to it as THRH. You may hear me refer to it as the joint component. It's all the same thing. But this is basically a project type that combines both transitional housing and rapid rehousing. I'll further describe it on an upcoming slide. This particular project type, even though it's listed here, it is only available excuse me, for the 3 remaining transitional housing projects that are currently receiving COC funding. And those include City Mission, Gallatin School, Community Action Inc. also has a transitional housing project, and then Liberty House up in Crawford County. So those are the only 3 remaining transitional housing projects receiving COC funding. These dollars are being made available to those 3 programs in order to further the COC's effort to connect all folks with permanent housing resources. We'll talk more about that on an upcoming slide. So if you're applying for the COC bonus, as most of you I'm sure already know, the Western PA COC includes 20 counties that are divided into 2 regions, the Northwest and Southwest Regional Homeless Advisory Board, or RABS. In previous years, the last couple of years, there's been a heavy emphasis on COC-wide and or RAB-wide projects. In fact, there have been a couple of years where all COC bonus dollars were limited to RAB level projects. That's not the case this year. You can apply to cover a single county or to cover a cluster of counties, to cover an entire RAB or the entire COC, depending on what your project is like. If you are applying for a new project, regardless of eligibility to apply for a single county, what is required is really that you show clear data to demonstrate the need for a single county project. And what I would also encourage is to ensure that that your narrative also include information about why a single county project is what's needed, as opposed to tapping into an existing or a new regional project. So making sure that it's clearly represented both in your data and the needs statement. There was a question submitted: is the Community Action Inc. TH project eligible for THRH joint component? I have not spoken to them directly at this point, but as one of the 3 transitional housing projects that are still receiving COC funding, they should be eligible, unless there's something that I'm not aware of specific to the project. But they are eligible. If you're just joining the 3 projects that are eligible, one is City Mission of Fayette County, their Gallatin School, Community Action Inc.'s Transitional Housing Program, and the Liberty House in Crawford County. So the housing types eligible under the new project RFP for the COC bonus: permanent supportive housing. Many of you are already familiar with this housing type, as Jessica will show you in some of the upcoming slides. The lion's share of the COC's investment is within permanent supportive housing. Permanent supportive housing is a non-time limited housing assistance that's paired with supportive services to assist individuals experiencing homelessness achieve housing stability. I just said individuals, but it would be both families and or adults without children, whether that's a single individual or a couple. All permanent supportive housing projects funded through the COC are required to indicate within their HUD application that they are dedicated to serve households that qualify as chronically homeless. There's a number of resources that really define chronic homelessness, including the RFP. But in short, it's households that have experienced 12 months of homelessness within a 3-year period of time. And that can be either episodically with 4 or more episodes during those 3 years, or continuously with 12 months or longer continual homelessness, as well as a disability. There's a reminder there that says, while the disability of a child may qualify the household for permanent supportive housing, a household does not meet the chronic definition if the child is the household member with the qualifying disability. So you can be eligible for permanent supportive housing. You're not eligible as chronically homeless. If you do not operate a permanent supportive housing project already, what I can tell you is that the policies of the COC and HUD policies basically require due diligence to identify any households who are classified as chronically homeless. If no households can be identified or no households that are willing to move to your community can be identified, then you serve sort of a prioritization list of other households. So there will be times where you will be enrolling someone who is chronic, and sometimes where you will be enrolling somebody who is highly vulnerable but does not meet the chronic definition. There was a question submitted asking, will we have access to the PowerPoint slides to print out? Yes, they either have been or will be posted to the COC website, and when the webinar is posted, we will ensure that the slides are also posted separately. Rapid rehousing, many folks are also familiar with this housing type. Which really is, I indicated that permanent supportive housing is non-time limited. Rapid rehousing, alternatively, provides short or medium-term rental assistance to assist households experiencing homelessness. There's no requirement like permanent supportive housing that households have a disability. Because the COC prioritizes all assistance for folks who are the most vulnerable, it's likely that if you're operating a rapid rehousing project that you very well may be serving a household with a disability. And the purpose of rapid rehousing is to, in fact, move as rapidly as possible into permanent housing and achieve housing stability. So rapid rehousing is, the model itself is designed to be time limited, individualized, and flexible. The core components of rapid rehousing include housing identification, rental assistance, and case management services. In terms of project eligibility, and this is going to apply to both the rapid rehousing and the joint component, those projects can serve folks who are part of HUD's Category 1 or 4 of the HUD homeless definition. So permanent supportive housing is the same, but like we said, you have to meet the chronic definition. So Category 1 is in any individual or household that is residing in an emergency shelter or a place not meant for human habitation. So that could be a car, it could be the woods, any sort of unsheltered location that you would count, for example, during the point in time count. And then Category 4, this is persons fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence situations. If you attended the training that occurred around, I think it was in March, you will know that that category has a far deeper meaning than just those few words on this screen. If you did not attend that training and you're interested in what on earth I'm talking about, I believe those slides are posted, but if not, we could certainly make those available. The point is that that category is I think far broader than most folks read it to be, based on the sort of Cliff Note version of the definition. In addition to Categories 1 and 4, this year's NOFA, the 2019 COC NOFA, includes a caveat which indicates that unaccompanied youth aged 24 and under, or families headed by youth aged 24 and under, so unaccompanied youth or parenting youth who have an unsafe primary nighttime residence and no safe alternative to that residence, may be served by youth serving providers and by providers who are operating youth designated projects funded under this NOFA. So what does that mean? That means that if you are a youth serving provider, which I will tell you that currently of organizations that are receiving COC funding through the Western PA COC, there are no quote unquote youth serving providers, no providers that would meet that definition as it's defined within the NOFA. And then it says, and by providers who are operating youth designated projects. We do have youth designated projects within the COC, and those projects would be able to serve youth, unaccompanied youth and parenting youth who have an unsafe primary residence. So the NOFA goes on to say that this caveat sort of supersedes any restrictions to this population that's indicated elsewhere. So if you do have a youth designated projects or you're interested in applying for one, I would really encourage you to read that section of the NOFA very carefully. It's a great option that will really allow you to expand assistance to youth. Okay, third project type, Joint Transitional Housing and Rapid Rehousing Component Project, THRRH. So as I've indicated a couple times, this is very limited eligibility. It is limited to the 3 transitional housing projects that are currently receiving COC funding. Again, that's City Mission, Gallatin School, Community Action Inc., and the Liberty House in Crawford County. If you operate one of these projects and you have questions, you should certainly call our office so we can try to help answer those questions for you and guide you through it. The important things that you really need to know is that if you are going to apply for the joint component, you will have to voluntarily reallocate your current transitional housing grant. And we can talk you through the machinations as to why and how that happens. But basically you can't receive you can have 2 separate grants funding the same transitional housing beds. That's the most nutshell version of that I can provide on the webinar. So as I've already indicated, this joint component combines transitional and rapid rehousing into a single project. The recipient must be able to provide both components of housing to all project participants. When entering the project, the participant can choose whether or not they want to enter a transitional housing unit or go directly into rapid rehousing. In some cases, especially if someone is in an emergency shelter or if they're unsheltered, they may, just to be able to have some additional stability right away, want to move into a transitional housing unit and then move as quickly as possible into rapid rehousing. The model may look slightly different based on the project, but the intention is that the transitional housing is very short term, and as quickly as possible, households are assisted to obtain permanent housing, which rapid rehousing is considered to be permanent housing. In total, project participants can receive only up to 24 months of assistance. That is similar to the guidelines of just straight rapid rehousing and just transitional housing projects. So what they're basically indicating is that the combination of these 2 resources still can't exceed the length of time assistance would be available if you were just in either a TH or an RRH project. The RFP indicates, it provides additional details about what costs are eligible, and I think it's also on one of the upcoming slides. So this slide really applies to the DV bonus as well, which we're going to talk about next. But a lot of these concepts, we refer back to this slide there. So within housing costs, the HUD grant, your COC grant can request operating funds, rental assistance, and leasing. So operating funds would be to operate a site that either is owned or leased by your organization. So if you have a building, these are likely the funds that you would want to look at. Regardless of what type of funding or what kind of, how you want to structure your proposed project, I would really encourage you to refer back to the COC regulation to ensure that you're requesting eligible funding sources, eligible line items, and that you are requesting the proper budget line items between operating, rental assistance, and leasing. So if you have a building, there's a significant chance that you may need operating funds. That could be used for permanent supportive housing, and it could also be to operate the transitional portion of the joint component projects. Rental assistance is when the project subsidizes the rent on behalf of the program participant. The program participant enters into a lease with the landlord and pays 30% of their income towards the rent, and then the project pays the balance of the rent directly to the landlord. Leasing, and I will just say that if you're operating a rapid rehousing project, you must request rental assistance. If you're operating permanent supportive housing, you could actually request any of these three types: operations, rental assistance, or leasing. For leasing, that could be either leasing a single site or scattered site units in the community. The difference here is that your organization would enter into the lease with the landlord, and then there would be a sublease or rental agreement with the program participant. Your organization would pay 100% of the rent directly to the landlord, and then the program participant would pay their portion of the rent to your organization. So a couple things to note regarding eligible housing costs. As I've already indicated, permanent supportive housing projects may request any of these three types of funds. But the important thing to know is that some of these budget line items cannot be mixed. For example, you cannot request leasing and rental assistance within a single project unless that was a joint component. But permanent supportive housing, leasing, and rental assistance don't mix. You could request operations dollars and leasing dollars, for example, but the important thing to note is that the total amount of funding that you're requesting cannot exceed fair market rent. So if you need to request leasing and operations, you would have to request leasing dollars for an amount that is less than fair market rent levels. Or not request the operations. As I've already indicated, rapid rehousing projects can only request rental assistance, and then the joint component can request operations or leasing to cover the transitional housing portion of the project. And then, similar to rapid rehousing, rental assistance, the only eligible cost there. Supportive services. So there's a number of supportive services that can be paid for through the CoC application. Within the application, if you haven't looked at the budget sheet yet or at the full RFP, I will just let you know that depending on the type of supportive services cost that you're requesting, more information may be requested. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The purpose of requesting supportive service dollars is really to ensure that households are assisted to obtain and maintain their housing. Typically, that means case management. It means housing locator services, things like that. So we want to make sure that as quickly as possible, regardless of the project type, that households have adequate assistance to identify a unit in the community that they can move into, with organizations that have housing locator services provided and have established relationships with community landlords can often assist with identifying units much more quickly than organizations that do not have those services. This is really important because one of the things that, especially if you're new to the CoC, you haven't already heard me say this 15 times, but one of the things the CoC is looking to do is to reduce the length of time individuals and families experience homelessness. The goal that's stated within the CoC strategic plan is 50 days. And the goal is to continue to reduce the length of time homeless over the next 5 years until and meet that goal of 50 days. I can tell you that over the last couple of years, since the strategic plan was approved by the governing board, the length of time has been steadily decreasing. But that length of time between this person, John Smith, is enrolled in our project, and now we have John Smith, who was in shelter or unsheltered situation in a permanent housing unit. That length of time between those two dates is really important, and we're really looking to make inroads on those dates to reduce that length of time. So housing search is clearly going to be an important feature, that if you don't have a dedicated person, that you've got sort of that role or that responsibility assigned to your case manager or someone else within the organization. We want to make sure that folks have adequate access to case management to ensure that housing stability can be achieved. So if you're going to be requesting services such as childcare or education services, employment assistance, job training, food, legal services, life skills training, even mental health services, outpatient health services or substance use treatment services, there will be some questions within the application that you're asked to respond to, specifically to talk through whether or not you can identify a community partner in order to leverage those resources. We've got a couple questions. In the hard copy of the application, there are several questions which appear to be applicable to permanent supportive housing. Am I correct in assuming that an applicant for a RAPID would not complete these questions? I don't have the hard copy in front of me, Rex, but I will see if we can answer that question. In fact, that's what I believe can answer.
Yes, when you go into Survey Gizmo, they will only require those questions for PSH applicants.
Okay. So, thank you. So the hard copy that you may be looking at is just a list of all questions, but when you go into the electronic and select the project type, you, like Jessica said, you'll only see the questions that are relevant. That isn't just based on project type, it will be based on a number of questions that you answer throughout. You'll only receive the questions that are relevant to you. Okay, I'm not going to go through this slide, but what I want you to know is that if you are coming in for funding, please make sure that you read this information about what administrative costs can include, and ensure that you are your request is consistent with the regulation. So are there match requirements? Yes. Everything but leasing dollars require a 25% match. So for example, if you're applying for either 10 units of rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing using a rental assistance model, and that is a total of $100,000 between those 10 units and a case manager, you're going to need to have a 25% match or $25,000 match. Match can be cash that is contributed to the program, whether it's by your organization, through donations, through funding that you receive through the United Way, whatever it is. If cash is not an option, in-kind match is also eligible. That can be, I would hope that match would not be a barrier for folks. If it is, I would really encourage you to talk to another organization that's operating a CoC funded project. If your organization, for example, where your office is if your office space and allocation of your office space is not included in the budget, then that can be part of your in-kind match. If you have a computer with internet access and a telephone and things like that that are already being provided, all of that can be allocated towards your in-kind match. If your supervision, the supervision of case managers, if that supervisor is not going to be included in the budget, that can count towards in-kind match. If there are services that your organization provides, and you can document those, anything that is on this list right here for services, if you are connecting your program participants to this and they're using those, and that can be documented through an MOU, all of that can count towards the match as well. It's not limited to only supportive services match. That's just often where folks find they can most easily obtain their match requirement. All match must be for activities that are eligible, which is what I just indicated, even if those activities are not funded under the grant. So if you request, let's say, life skills training for $1,000 through the CoC funding, and you also provide an in-kind match of an additional $5,000 of life skills training, that's fine. That can be something that you count towards match. If you do not have, however, let's say food as part of your budget, but your organization provides upon move-in of an individual, a $200 gift card to the local supermarket, you could in fact count that towards the match, the food there. So it doesn't have to be something that is in your grant, but it can be, is the point that I'm trying to make there. Okay, special considerations. Again, this will also apply to the domestic violence bonus. All housing programs are expected to operate in accordance with a housing first approach. That includes both that program participants are not screened out of the program because of things like no income or a history or active substance use, a criminal record, etc. Participants are also not allowed to be terminated from the program based on failure to participate in supportive services or to follow a service plan. There's more information that's provided there, but basically, if you're receiving CoC funding, you must follow a housing first approach. All project participants, this is both at initial lease up as well as turnover, must come from the CoC's prioritized waiting list. If you are receiving CoC funding, you must enter your data into PHMIS. That's the Homeless Management Information System. If you're a victim service organization, you're not allowed to enter data into HMIS per state law. And as such, you must enter that data into a DV comparable database. All applicants are expected to participate in either the RAB meetings or the Northwest provider meetings, to become members of the CoC, to attend CoC meetings and trainings that are provided by the CoC, as well as the applicants must have the capacity to operate the program in accordance with HUD requirements, which include things like submitting the APR on time, draw down funds at least quarterly, etc. There's a comment that just came in that is basically just indicating that in the Northwest, the folks are not by default a member of the RAB, whereas providers in the Southwest region are. Instead, it's the Northwest Collaborative Meeting. I just called it the Northwest Provider Meeting, so I apologize for that, but that's the meeting that I'm referring to. So the expectation there for the bullet, for this third from the bottom bullet, is that if you're in the Southwest region, that you will attend the RAB meeting, and if you are in the Northwest, you will attend the Northwest Collaborative Meeting. The scoring criteria, the selection criteria being used, it's really listed here. Basically, things that we're going to be looking for Did you identify a need for this project in your community, both through the data and the narrative? Will you, commit to serving all household types? And you're going to find out why just a minute as soon as I stop talking and hand the mic over to Jessica. We're going to look at things like your approach to case management. We want to make sure that if you are requesting to serve 25 households, that you've got either through the COC funding or through leveraged case management, you've got enough staffing to really support that, but that the case management ratio makes sense. We're going to be looking at the approach to providing supportive services and hoping to also see leverage services from community partners. Want to make sure that you have the ability to assist households for that housing search and location services. We're looking at cost effectiveness, your experience with Housing First, your experience just providing overall homeless assistance, your experience overall providing client-centered and culturally competent services. If you're applying to operate a regional or a COC-wide project, that you have the capacity to really do that, regardless of the geographic area to be served, that you've got the organizational capacity to operate the project successfully. If you are currently or previously receiving COC or ESG funds, we want to make sure that there are no concerns or issues related to the previous funding that you have been awarded. And if you've never received COC funding, that will be considered as well. One of the requirements of HUD is that we really look to encourage new members of the COC to come in and apply for funding and to really continue to expand our membership. Okay, the next RFP I really want to talk through very quickly is the new project RFP for domestic violence bonus. It was released the same day, earlier this week on Tuesday. It's also due on August 21st. As I indicated earlier, HUD has made $50 million available nationally to specifically fund DV projects through a DV bonus. The COC is eligible for $906,000. Part of that has been set aside to specifically add infrastructure to support coordinated entry and to ensure that survivors can equally access resources through the COC through the coordinated entry system. The remainder of those dollars, $810,000, have been set aside for rapid rehousing. And the COC hopes to allocate approximately $284,000 of that to the Northwest region and approximately $527,000 to the Southwest region. For those of you who know, the COC, when it was first merged, the Northwest and Southwest RABs, there was like a pro rata or an annual renewal demand that was established, basically a prenup between the two COCs to say, I have about 35% of the money that is currently available between our merged COC, the Northwest had, and the Southwest had about 65%. And so that's what this division here represents, a 35-65 split. If a project comes in and does not adhere to those percentages, I am certain that the funding committee will look at the data to support a variance on that request, but that's just sort of the target there that we're looking to see to really maintain that Northwest-Southwest balance of funding. Just a note that the RFP is limited to victim service providers. If you are a victim service provider and you would like to apply, but you lack some of the experience necessary, whether it's that you have never operated rental assistance or conducted inspections, etc., we would encourage you to perhaps partner with local organizations that have provided those kinds of services in the past in order to be eligible. Quick thing to know is that if you are applying for the DB bonus, the geographic area to be covered, you really have one of three options within your application. You can opt to cover all 20 counties of the COC, You can opt to cover the 13 counties in the Northwest region or the 7 counties in the Southwest. So if you are applying, you need to cover one of those 3 geographic areas, and there's a place within the application where you will indicate which of those 3 areas you're covering. I already talked about this in a previous slide, but this particular DV bonus RFP is specifically for rapid rehousing. There is a lot of information, and there's some resources that you'll be directed to within the RFP about DV rapid rehousing specifically, but this is more or less the same definition that was already reviewed. Who is eligible? We talked about this already. This is just a little bit of an expansion. In addition to the folks that have previously been included in the category 4 HUD homeless definition, the NOFA also indicates that folks who are fleeing or attempting to flee human trafficking, including sex trafficking, are also likely eligible. What can the funding be used for? Rental assistance, because that's the only housing cost that's eligible for rapid rehousing. Supportive services costs, which we've already talked through. HMIS cost, and what this says is while victim services providers are not permitted to enter data into HMIS, you are required to have an HMIS comparable database. Many of the victim service providers use ETO, and there is an enhancement within ETO that will allow you to collect all the HUD data in addition to the data required for DV funding sources. In addition, administrative costs can be requested up to 10%. Yes, there's still a match, just like we already talked about from the previous slide. Special considerations, this slide is almost identical to the other slide that we already reviewed, except for that bullet that is sort of green and bold. All providers are expected to provide tailored services to each project participant based on the survivor's individual needs using a trauma-informed and victim-centered approach. So that's really what the difference is here. Obviously, no matter who you're serving, folks who have experienced homelessness often have also experienced a significant amount of trauma. So I think this is just best practice to use a trauma-informed approach, but nonetheless, a trauma-informed and victim-centered approach is required for the DV bonus funds. Selection criteria, it's very similar to the selection criteria that we reviewed for the CoC bonus RFP. Differences include, for this, you absolutely have to have the capacity to implement a regional or CoC-wide project because single county projects won't be considered. You have to have experience with DV housing first. You have to have experience providing that trauma-informed victim-centered, culturally competent services, etc. Okay, I'm going to talk fast because we're running behind here. I want to make sure that you guys have enough time to really hear the data. It's the most interesting part of the presentation as well. New project expansion and transition. I know a lot of folks are interested in expansion projects. So basically, HUD will allow project applicants to apply for new expansion project, whether you're coming in for the DV bonus, reallocation, or the regular CoC bonus. A renewal project applicant may submit a new project application to expand current operations. So this is really important. If you're considering expansion, you can expand your project in order to add new units, add new beds, increase the number of persons served, or provide additional services. So those are reasons why you may want to consider a project expansion. If you are applying for project expansion, hopefully you've already submitted your renewal application. This is limited to folks who are already operating a CoC funded project. So just to be clear, if you're on the line and you're listening because you want to apply for the first time or you previously received COC funding, if you don't have a current grant, this wouldn't apply to you. This is really just a very streamlined way for a project to take an existing program that's operating well and to expand it. There's a lot of information on the HUD eSnaps, HUD Exchange under the eSnaps page about the expansion. If you have some specific questions, our office can help you as well, but we would really encourage you to look at the resources that we'll direct you to towards the end of the webinar. For projects that are expanding their current COC funded project, they'll be required to submit 3 applications. So this would be if you were selected, right? You don't need to do this right now. What you do need to do right now is to make sure that you've already submitted your renewal project application because they were due on Tuesday. And then you will also submit the preliminary application, which is the stage that we're at now. If your project is selected, you will then do number 2, which is shown here, a new project application with just the expansion information. So if you already have 10 units and 1.75 case manager, and you want to increase to 15 units and make that case manager full-time, you would be submitting a new project application that was for those 5 units and a 0.25 case manager. In addition to that, you're going to submit a 3rd application, which is the renewal project application that basically is the combined of those 2. It's the 0.75 case manager that you currently have with your 10 units, plus the 0.25 case manager you want to add and the 5 units you want to have. And that 3rd application would reflect 15 units full-time case manager. So there would be 3 applications in total required. Transition grants. I don't know that we're going to have anybody who wants to transition their grant, but in the event that we do, basically what happens is that it's actually a great tool. The existing project is eliminated. It's voluntarily reallocated on paper, but what happens is that when at the time your project would renew, so if your grant expires on June 30th and renews on July 1, your project would be that new project that you're creating. So you would have, no gap in funding. The other really cool thing that happens through a transition grant is that you have a period of time to sort of wind down the current project and to wind up or launch the new project. If you are interested in this and have questions, again, the resources on eSnaps can provide a lot more information, but you can also reach out to us and we can talk you through it. There really are very few projects within the COC, if any, that I think at this point a transition would make a lot of sense or that they would be eligible for, but it's still there. I'm sure that there are nuances that I'm not aware of that folks may want to look into this if based on the needs of your project. Okay, very quickly, this is laid out in the RFP, but we just want to talk through the process and timelines. The application, whether it's for the regular, the COC bonus, or the DV bonus, must be submitted in Survey Gizmo by August 21st. This is the links that are on the screen right now are the links to access the preliminary application. What I can tell you is that what's been distributed and what's been posted on the COC website is a hard copy, just so that you can see the questions in advance. I know that sometimes if you click on a link and you can only see a certain number of questions, it's hard to know what information you need to have in front of you in order to be able to complete the application. There is a save function, so if you start the application and you can't complete everything at once, you can save and come back and pick up where you left off. There is also a separate Excel template budget page. Every year we get budgets that are wrong, and we really have to go back and forth to make sure that we're clear about exactly how much money is being requested and how those dollars are going to be used. What I can tell you is that Jessica, who's sitting here next to me, has really created an Excel document that I think will help to streamline that and allow us to know exactly how much money you're requesting and and allow you to feel confident that the budget that you're submitting is in fact correct. So that will be uploaded into Survey Gizmo. There's a place that you will do that. So you'll download the budget, complete it, save it to your computer, and then within the Survey Gizmo, you'll upload it when prompted. So what is your budget? So if you're applying for the COC bonus, the maximum dollars that we have available through the bonus are $481,274. If any reallocation of existing dollars occurs, that number will rise. But at this point, this is the amount that we know that we have available. So please don't submit an application exceeding that request. If you are applying for the new DV bonus, I've already indicated the maximum budget there is $810,751. If you're coming in to apply for the full 20 counties, please request the whole unless you don't feel like the data supports that level of funding. We don't want to leave money on the table because I think that the data does demonstrate that there's enough need to support that. So I'm not worried that we won't get $481,000 worth of requests, but I just want to make sure that if you are coming in for the DV bonus that you request at least the full amount as indicated by the region or for the whole COC. Just a quick note to let you know that regardless of the amount that you receive, the funding committee reserves the right to approve an amount other than requested. In some cases, that may be that you requested $100,000 and there's no other request to cover a particular county, and your project covers that, and we ask you to add another unit to cover a particular community. So that actually could increase or decrease in order to hopefully respond to need in each part of the COC where it's been identified. New applications, the application process. So I've already indicated by the 21st, we ask that your preliminary application is submitted by the close of business. After that, the funding committee will meet and to review those applications, and no later than August 30th, you will be notified if your project has been accepted or rejected based on the evaluation process through the funding committee. If you have questions when you're trying to put your project together, you can certainly send an email to the COC's email, westerncoc@pennsylvaniacoc.org. Those emails come to our office. If you are on the line and you can hear me, please do not send Leigh, me, an email. I have so many emails coming in, and I really don't want you to be at a disadvantage by emailing me directly. So please make sure that your email goes to the COC email address, because somebody will certainly be able to get back to you, whereas your email may sit for a few days before I'm able to respond. Appeals. So basically, I encourage you to read this on your own. Like we said, the slides will be circulated, but here's what you need to know. If you submit an application, you will be informed, as already indicated, by the 30th of August, whether or not your project was selected. If you feel that your project was unfairly not selected, you can certainly submit an appeal to the COC. If you do, your appeal will be considered by the non-conflicted members of the COC's governing board. So that means board members who do not receive COC funding. And if they do, they're not competitively ranked. So what that means is, for example, DCED, the Department of Community and Economic Development, they serve as the COC's collaborative applicant, and they're a member of the governing board. They also submit the COC's planning grant, which is not ranked, and they also submit the COC's HMIS grant, which is ranked, but it's not ranked competitively. It's ranked in Tier 1 based on policies of the COC, not based on their performance. So that's just one example of what that actually means. So the non-conflicted members of the COC's governing board will hear your appeal and make a decision and get back to you. There's 2 email addresses that are provided on the slide that you would submit your appeal to if you were going to appeal, and you would need to include any sort of relevant rationale or documentation that should be considered by those governing board members. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Jessica, who's going to walk us through the gaps analysis and the data that she's pulled together.
New projects only be considered for permanent supportive housing or TV bonus. That is, if we don't apply for housing, is that not an option? No. Just no.
Okay, we have a question come in. Jessica was just reading it. Just for clarification, are new projects only being considered for permanent supportive housing or DV rapid rehousing bonus? That is, if we want to apply for rapid rehousing for other purposes, is that an option? Yes. So under the CoC bonus RFP, you may apply for permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, or the joint component if you are one of those 3 organizations that receives CoC funding for transitional housing.
Cool. Guys, getting settled in here. We're swapping places really quick. All right, so we're going to go through this gaps analysis. It does get pretty in-depth with the data. I imagine folks may have questions. If there are clarification questions, feel free to submit those. I imagine folks may have like drill down questions where you have questions that we may not have available today that we may not be able to answer. But we'll try to give as much information as possible. And the reason we're presenting this data is so that folks are informed about where some of the gaps are in the CoC around current resources. That gives you the most information possible when you're preparing your application for new project funding. So what we're going to present is the landscape of where the current housing inventory is and where some of the CoC funding is currently going. We're going to go through coordinated entry data, which goes through who is coming to the system for assistance by household type, subpopulation, and service needs to see where the greatest demand is for resources. And then we're going to break down the demand and the supply. So based on the current inventory and demand, where are the biggest gaps in the system? And also where is the CoC fairly well resourced and where do we need more resources currently? So we're going to start with the current inventory and resource landscape. So this chart goes through the current housing inventory. So on the left, you'll see the housing inventory as of January 2019. Every year, the CoC submits a housing inventory chart to HUD, which breaks down the housing inventory. So in blue, you'll see the beds that were designated for households without children, so singles and couples. And you'll see it broken down from left to right for those who may not be familiar with these acronyms. ES is emergency shelter, TH is transitional housing, RRH is rapid rehousing, and PSH is permanent supportive housing. You will see those acronyms throughout, so just so you know what those are. And then the green is units for families. So that chart shows you what the inventory was in January of 2019 for singles and then for families. On the right, you'll see specifically what the permanent housing inventory was, so permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. The biggest piece of the pie, I guess you could call it, in orange, is permanent supportive housing for households without children. So we're going to, moving forward, call that singles and couples. So 52% of the inventory in Western PA was for singles and couples. And then in red, the next biggest piece of the pie was rapid rehousing for singles and couples. Next was permanent supportive housing for families, and next was rapid rehousing for families. So this gives you a sense of what the inventory was. As we get further into this, you'll also see what the demand was, because it's hard to tell what this inventory means on its own without knowing, well, who really is coming to the system and who needs the what's the demand for resources. So we'll get into that. And where is COC funding going? Leigh mentioned this a little bit earlier, but the biggest piece of the pie for funding from the COC goes to permanent supportive housing. So this is COC funding from last year's competition, FY18. 68% of COC funding goes to fund permanent supportive housing. 21% goes to rapid rehousing. 5% goes to supportive services only, so that's SSO. That's primarily right now funds coordinated entry services. 2% goes to transitional housing. 2% to that joint component that Leigh talked about, transitional housing and rapid rehousing. And then 1% to HMIS, which is very important. We need to have data to be able to understand what's going on in our system. So that's the breakdown of where the funding is going. Then we're going to break it down by our regions so that we kind of know where is the funding going based on regions. So that chart on the left in green, you'll see that based on housing funding. So this chart only looks at housing funding. So it only looks at funding for permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, transitional housing, and that joint component. It doesn't look at supportive services only or HMIS. So in green on the left, you'll see that 57% of the housing funding was going to the Southwest region and 43% was going to the Northwest region. On the right, we kind of take that pie chart and break it down even further into what types of housing were being funded in each region. So in the Northwest region, you'll see that the types of housing that was being funded and at what level they were being funded. And then in the Southwest, you'll see what types of housing was being funded and at what levels. Again, I'm not going into this in super detail, but my hope is that when you're putting together your application or as you're working on system planning in general in the future, that this data will be valuable to you. Then we break it down by county. What funding is being allocated by county or by region? So as Leigh mentioned, many projects within the COC are regional. There's some counties that are maybe quite small in terms of the demand for services, or it makes more sense to have a regional project covering them. And in some counties, the demand for services is very, very high, as you'll see when we get into the data in a little bit. So you'll see on the far left, the Northwest region, that green bar on the left, that's a project that serves the entire Northwest region. That's a rapid rehousing project. Then as we work our way right, that one next to it is a regional project that serves several Northwest counties. That's a permanent supportive housing project. And then as you go further along, you'll see projects that are maybe clusters of counties that are permanent supportive housing or transitional housing, projects that are serving just a single county. And you'll see what projects types those are. And then we get to the Southwest region, which is that second large green bar, the Southwest region. That's a regional rapid rehousing project that serves the entire Southwest region. And then as we work our way to the right, you'll see which counties have which types of projects. I think this data will be helpful as we get further into the gaps analysis and look at where some of the demand for services is in each county. So I'm going to give you a preview of the data we're about to walk through because it gets pretty dense. So a little preview of what we're about to see is there's a high demand for rapid rehousing in the Western COC. There's a higher demand for resources for singles and couples, aka households without children. Data shows that the COC is more equipped to meet the needs of families than singles and couples at this time. However, families experiencing homelessness are a high priority population for HUD and the COC. So the COC will need to continue to consider how to meet the needs of families experiencing homelessness with a goal of ending family homelessness. And I know Leigh mentioned the COC is really looking at projects that can serve all household types. And there's an increasing demand, and I think this is true across many COCs, for prevention and diversion resources. The data does indicate that the COC could have capacity to end chronic homelessness with the existing permanent supportive housing inventory through strategic targeting of resources. And we'll see that as we get into the data.
Before you do this, I just want to build on the slide of what Jessica's saying, because I think these observations are really important. And as she's indicated, she's going to sort of walk you through it. But the important things I just want to emphasize is that the COC has both within the strategic plan a goal to reduce family homelessness by 50%, which is obvious then that this is a high priority population for the COC. In addition, there's a goal to reduce overall homelessness based on any population type by 50%. And so it really is a balance that even though HUD is prioritizing families, although the COC is prioritizing families, in order to really be able to reduce homelessness to the extent that we're looking to do across the COC, we've got to also do increase resources to serve singles and couples, even though there are significant resources already dedicated to singles and couples. We have a lot of need there. The other thing is that the increased need for or demand for prevention and diversion resources, hopefully all of you had the opportunity to see the addendum to the Home for Good RFP, which included a priority of diversion resources. And so diversion is not an eligible cost under the COC funding. And so the COC has sort of prioritized that diversion as a resource under the Home for Good funding source. The other thing I just want to emphasize is that the last bullet that Jessica just said, that the COC could have the capacity to end chronic homeless with existing PSH inventory through strategic targeting. And so what I really would like to encourage anybody who's considering to come in and applying for PSH is to ensure that within your statement of need, that you're talking about why additional PSH is needed in your community, right? So our beds for PSH are chronic dedicated. So if you don't have a lot of chronic within your community, if you do, I would certainly encourage you to include that in your narrative. But if you don't, you need to talk about why PSH is needed for the folks who are experiencing homelessness in your community, and why rapid rehousing, for example, is not a long-term enough resource to actually end homelessness among these folks. So I would really encourage, if you're going to apply for PSH, that you really think through and describe as well as you can. And please, of course, you refer to this data when it's applicable, but to really think through why PSH is the needed resource.
No, that's great. All righty. So now we're going to get into some coordinated entry data. So all of the data I'm going to walk you through is annual data from April 2018 to March 2019. Thank you to Brian Wheeler at DCD's HMIS team for all of his wonderful help with pulling this data. Okay, so we're going to break it down in multiple ways by household type, subpopulation, RAB, county, bit by bit, so it's not too overwhelming. So first of all, let's look at household type. So from April 2018 to March 2019, almost 3,000 households, 2,886 households experiencing homelessness or housing instability of some type were assessed through the coordinated entry system. Hopefully most of you are familiar with that. It's the centralized system for folks experiencing housing instability to access services through the COC. So of those households who access services, 65% were singles and couples, households without children, and 35% were families, households with children. So what happened to these households within a year's time? What was their outcome? So the outcomes that we have listed here is active, meaning they came through the system during that year, and at the end of the year, they were still active, meaning they were awaiting some sort of housing placement. or some sort of resolution to their housing situation. They were enrolled or placed, meaning they were accepted and or moved into some sort of housing placement. And then closed, meaning the situation wasn't resolved, they were closed out either by their own choice, meaning they said, oh, I resolved my situation on my own. Most of the time, the closed means that contact was lost with the individual, more times than not. So families who presented had a slightly higher rate of enrollment or placement through the coordinated entry system into housing than singles and couples. You'll see here, families had a rate of 38% of enrollment and placement into housing through coordinated entry, and singles and couples had a rate of 33%. So now let's look at some subpopulation data. So of the households who accessed coordinated entry during that year, 4% of the households were identified as experiencing chronic homelessness. So that's 124 of the households. 7% of the households were veterans, so 193 of the households. 12% were youth, whether unaccompanied youth or parenting youth, and that's 340 households. And then 20% of the households were individuals or families experiencing domestic violence. That's 627 households. Of those households, 56% of the households experiencing chronic homelessness were enrolled in placed in housing, which is, as you all may remember from the last slide, is higher than the average placement rate. 65% of the veteran households were enrolled or placed in housing, which again is much higher than the average placement rate. 33% of youth were enrolled or placed in housing, and 33% of people experiencing domestic violence were enrolled or placed in housing, which is pretty consistent with that average placement rate. So like I mentioned, veterans and chronically homeless households have the highest housing placement rate across the COC, which is great. Those are two of the populations that HUD has really been emphasizing over the last several years, saying COCs really need to have a coordinated strategy to address homelessness among veterans and people experiencing chronic homelessness. So that really speaks to efforts that are happening across the COC. One thing I did want to note is that 58% of all households who came through coordinated entry were not a part of any of these subpopulations. So they're either an individual or a family that does not meet any of these four subpopulations. So they would not be eligible for any type of housing that might be subpopulation specific. All right, now we're going to go into some data about the RABs. So the coordinated entry status by RAB, I already mentioned what these definitions mean: closed, enrolled, placed, or active. So Northwest RAB had a higher enrollment placement rate than the Southwest RAB during that year's time. 42% of the households who went through the Northwest RAB had an enrollment or a placement into housing, and 29% of the households coming through the Southwest RAB. Household types. 39% of households coming through the Northwest RAB were families. 61% were singles. 33% of households coming through the Southwest were families, and 67% were singles. I know I found that interesting. I always find data interesting that the Southwest RAB is serving a higher rate of singles, 67%. The Northwest RAB is serving 61%. I have no idea why that might be. It's just interesting data that came out of coordinated entry. This particular percentage is not up here. You could certainly do the math if you wanted to, but you'll see here the Northwest RAB assessed 1,206 households and the Southwest 1,680. So just for those who don't feel like doing the math in their head, the Northwest assessed 42% of the households over the course of that year, and the Southwest RAB assessed 58% of the households over that year. All right, this is the fun chart where it's like, what am I looking at? What am I reading? So I'm going to break it down for you. So first of all, if you're just seeing what am I noticing right away, first of all, you can see the counties who assessed the highest number of households over the course of the year. So you'll see some counties that really stand out. So obviously Westmoreland assessed the highest number of households during the course of that year, 567 households. Butler, 356, Lawrence, 272, McKean, Clearfield, Washington, others as well in there. You'll also, the data is also, you can kind of see it, and I'd be more than happy to provide this data to any folks who have like sort of a data inclination like me. We're going to break this down in a couple of slides. We'll break down how many households were active in each county at a point in time. So we'll get into that in a little bit to see that. Housing needs. So this slide I'm going to walk you through. So we undertook a process to calculate what the service demand was. So essentially, what percentage of the folks coming through the coordinated entry system who are experiencing homelessness are going to need various types of interventions. Based on the data that we analyzed, we estimated that 74% of the households would need rapid rehousing, 18% would need prevention, and 8% would need permanent supportive housing. Caveat, the data that was available to us is somewhat limited, which I will talk about in just a moment. So basically, how did we calculate this demand and say that this is what our analysis is? So first of all, we looked at how many households are coming through coordinated entry who are at risk of homelessness. We took that number and said that that percentage of households, which was 18% of all the households coming through coordinated entry, would need prevention resources. Then we took the households who are literally homeless and we said how many of them are going to be eligible for permanent supportive housing. So based on the demand that they have a disability and that they are chronically homeless. So we took that number and that's how we got our permanent supportive housing demand. And then we also took the rapid rehousing demand, subtracting those other two numbers. Couple of caveats. We know there are probably households captured here who may have been able to be diverted from the system with some other type of assistance, but those are not captured here. Another caveat is there may be folks who may be most appropriate for permanent supportive housing and maybe they need that long-term subsidy or support that are not captured within this data. It's very difficult based on the coordinated entry scoring system and also method for gathering info on disability and chronic status. It's self-report. We imagine that that number may be a bit higher, just based on some of the limitations of the data. So keep that in mind as we go through. So with that data in mind, we're going to look at how many active households were on the coordinated entry list at a point in time. So at the end of that year, March 31st, 2019, how many folks were on the coordinated entry list who would need one of those interventions? So we estimated it and said, based on this premise that we just went through, about 47% of the households on the coordinated entry list were singles or couples who would need rapid rehousing. About 26% were families who would need rapid rehousing. About 15% were individuals who would need prevention resources. About 7% were families who would need prevention resources. About 6% were singles or couples who would need PSH and also be eligible for PSH. That's important to keep in mind. And then in the bottom, in the red, families who would need PSH and also be eligible was quite low, less than 1%. So I think this snapshot really gives a picture of, at a single point in time, what percentage of the folks who are waiting on the coordinated entry list might need a certain type of intervention. And I think this is helpful when thinking about the types of resources that really might be needed in the COC. All right, I promised I would come back to that county data. So this is the snapshot of active households awaiting housing on that single point in time, March 31st, by county and by RAB. So it breaks it down by singles and by families. This doesn't break it down by service need. Again, the data, you can get way into the weeds, but you can see who is waiting housing in which counties on a single point in time, where's the highest demand in each county that may have been unmet at a single point in time, and which household type. So you'll see some counties clearly stand out. They had a pretty high demand at a single point in time, and some of them had a pretty high demand for certain household types. So you'll see, for example, Westmoreland and Washington, there was a pretty significant number of singles and couples who were awaiting housing at a single point in time. And some other counties as well, you'll be able to see kind of where the demand was at a point in time. So we hope this data is helpful to folks as they're putting together kind of the needs assessment for their own community. All right, this chart I will walk you through. So we used some fun math to analyze what the demand and the supply was in each RAB and the COC overall for rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. So we took what the annual demand for rapid rehousing would be in each RAB. That's the green, the far left green. So based on how many folks might need rapid rehousing in a year. Then we took how many units of rapid rehousing were on the January 2019 housing inventory chart. Then, based on the COC's average turnover rate of rapid rehousing, which was 106%, we calculated what is the COC's current rapid rehousing capacity relative to meet the demand. And you'll see in the Northwest RAB, the COC has 21% rapid rehousing capacity relative to meet the demand. That was our calculation. In the Southwest RAB, there's 13% capacity to meet the demand for rapid rehousing, and overall 16% capacity to meet the demand for rapid rehousing in the COC overall. We did the same premise for PSH with two different turnover rates because there was some discrepancy about which turnover rate to use. So what's the demand for PSH annually? You'll see for the Northwest RAB and for the Southwest RAB and overall, how many units were available according to the housing inventory chart. And based on the turnover rate, so the average turnover rate for the COC was 25%, but then an annual turnover rate on average nationally is 20%. So based on that annual turnover rate nationally, we said that the Northwest RAB has about 59% capacity to meet the demand, the Southwest 64% capacity to meet the demand, and overall 61% capacity to meet the demand. So we hope this data is helpful to you. We hope that it provides some insight into where the gaps are, and really that you can dive into it deeper. We know we gave a very, very rapid overview of the data, but we hope that it will be insightful to you as you move forward with your new project application.
So I mentioned earlier that we were going to have some tips for eSnaps. Again, in case you joined late, we're not going to walk through these tips. We just want you to know that they're here in this webinar. There are instructions or tips for completing the applicant profile, as well as how to set up a new project in eSnaps. If you are applying for a transition grant, there's instructions there. If you're going to be applying for an expansion grant, there's instructions. There's a slide that basically says what you can and can't do. That was the one that Jessica just went by with the yeses and nos and reds and greens. Talks about match, etc. If your project is selected for funding by the funding committee, you'll hear either way, whether your project was selected or not, by August 30th. When you find out that your project was selected, you will be given additional instruction and timelines around submitting your project application in eSnaps. If you're not familiar, eSnaps is HUD's electronic submission portal for COC funding applications. So you will be provided with instructions and timelines then. At that time, it would make sense to come back to this PowerPoint and review that. I can't emphasize to you that rather than calling us, the best thing you could do would be to go onto the HUD Exchange, go to the eSnaps page, and read the guides. They have very detailed guides with screenshots and all kinds of things that can really help walk you through. We can certainly help provide troubleshooting and technical assistance, but to get the best instructions along with the visual, that information really is available on the HUD Exchange. A couple other things just to quickly say is that when you submit your project application in the preliminary application in Survey Gizmo, you should receive a PDF of your application via email. The system is set up to automatically send you a PDF of your application. Within that, the application, a number of the questions refer to eSnaps question 4C or eSnaps question 6A or something like that. I bring that to your attention because if you are selected for funding, you will be able to use the information that you entered into your preliminary application to into the eSnap system. The questions were designed to be, if not identically aligned, very close to being aligned there. So those are all important things to know. And if you are completing the preliminary application and you see eSnaps, you'll understand why it won't be confusing. I mentioned a couple times about the detailed instructions and the navigational guides. These are the links to access those. And with that, that is our entire presentation, and we are actually right on time. So if you have not submitted a question yet, please feel free to do so now. If you think of a question later, please submit your question to Western COC at pennsylvaniacoc.org. Please, again, I don't mean to repeat myself, but please do not email me directly with a question. Brendan will be posting the webinar both on the COC webpage as well as on Workplace shortly. We look forward to reviewing your preliminary applications. I will also just say one additional thing. In the next few days, in the next week, very soon, there will be a document that's posted on the COC's webpage also that talks through the process. I know many of you are familiar with the process, both for renewal applications and for new project applications. But this is a new document that we've created this year. It's just waiting for me to send it to the board for approval so that we can post it. But it's sort of a procedure and a policy that outline how all decisions are made related to funding and who is making those decisions, whether it be the governing board, the non-conflicting members of the governing board, the funding committee, etc. And the idea of this document, or the purpose of this document, is to make sure that everybody understands how and why decisions are made, and to ensure that we're operating a fair and transparent funding process where everybody feels like they understand the process and has a fair shot at applying for and receiving COC funding. It doesn't mean that everybody will, but it hopefully means that you understand the process and how decisions were made, and then therefore understand that it was a fair process. So look for that document to be posted shortly on the COC webpage as well. Again, please let us know if you have any questions. August 21st, close of business, is the due date for your preliminary applications. And we will, I'm sure, be talking to many of you soon. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Leigh and Jessica, for doing this presentation and for everyone for attending. Again, if you have any questions, please forward them to the Western COC at pennsylvaniacoc.org. Have a good afternoon, everyone.